Welcome back to Unfair Housing. Thanks for joining us this week as we begin our discussion on urban renewal. As a reminder, we have several episodes available that cover the history of building suburbia under the New Deal, which help lay the foundation for today's discussion. If you missed any of our previous conversations on these topics, I recommend checking those out. Before we get started, please remember this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion on housing segregation, but rather provide you with highlights of policies and practices that led to housing segregation. We welcome lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that you exercise kindness and consideration when making and responding to comments. Okay, so let's get into it. Government and private actions we've discussed so far were successfully separating Black neighborhoods from white and stripping much of the wealth and opportunity for growth from Black neighborhoods. What naturally followed the implementation of these policies and practices in many of these areas was blight, or what was commonly referred to as the slums or ghettos. Blight is a term often used when describing properties that are in disrepair, run down, vacant or abandoned, and as a result of their poor condition, threatened to bring down the values of surrounding properties. The presence of blighted areas was used to develop urban renewal plans and determine the placement of highways throughout the country. Urban renewal discussions began in the early 1900s, and highway construction discussions began in the late 1930s under the FDR administration. But the plans for highway construction were largely executed in the late 1950s to late 1960s under the Eisenhower administration. Even prior to this time, the government used its legislative powers to take property from owners to use it for an alleged public purpose. This taking of property to build things like parks, expand college campuses, construct highways, and so on had devastating impacts on Black communities across the country. In 1919, Thomas H. McDonald was hired as the director of the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads, commonly known as BPR, formerly the U.S. Office of Public Roads. He served in the role for nearly 35 years, and during that time, he was instrumental in developing plans for a national highway system. McDonald met with FDR to map out the first interregional highway system. At FDR's request, McDonald and his assistant, H.S. Fairbanks, drafted BPR's report called the Toll Roads and Free Roads. The report suggested the highway plan should occur in concert with current and future plans to eliminate blight and initiate urban redevelopment. Interestingly, McDonald believed his plan would solve two issues at once: eliminate blighted areas and force families to reestablish themselves in the suburbs where there were better living conditions. Of course, as we've discussed many times throughout the season, relocation to the white suburbs was not possible for many of these families displaced by highway construction and urban renewal projects, because the majority of them were Black families. Like others who supported the use of highway construction to eliminate the slums, McDonald supported construction of new housing for those displaced and considered plans for housing a fundamental element of local government's determinations of where to construct highways. Unfortunately, very few opportunities were provided to families displaced by urban renewal and highway construction projects. As cities made plans for highway construction and urban revitalization in their own jurisdictions, housing replenishment was not included in their plans. Despite BPR working with a Housing and Home Finance Agency, a predecessor to HUD, no plans were made and no requirements were set to replace housing condemned and demolished by highway construction. And despite a requirement in urban renewal programs to replace lost housing, very little housing was ever built. By the 1960s, approximately 70,000 homes per year were demolished as a result of urban renewal programs and highway construction, many of which were low-income housing units. Plans for the country's highway system alone were known to likely displace more than 1 million people by the time it was completed. Yet the projects continued as planned. As white families began to flee to the suburbs, leaving urban areas without access to resources and proper funding, the federal government responded by passing the National Housing Act of 1949. The act provided federal funding to help cities renew urban areas and clear slums by authorizing over $1 billion in loans and grants to cities to purchase and clear land for urban revitalization. To successfully revitalize cities, the act emphasized construction of new buildings and infrastructure, but it did little to address the destruction of established and thriving communities taken and demolished by the government for these projects. But how did the government go about clearing blighted areas, particularly if the land at issue was not owned by the government? To acquire blighted areas slated for demolition, the government exercised a Fifth Amendment constitutional power called eminent domain. Eminent domain is a power held by the government to take private property for public use, so say to build a park, roadway, or building to house City Hall or a library. But as it turned out, much of the land taken by eminent domain for urban renewal projects ended up in the hands of private corporations to redevelop, or in some cases, just sat vacant. The Fifth Amendment does require just compensation when the government takes private property. However, as we'll discuss, just compensation for Black neighborhoods specifically was either insufficient or non-existent entirely. The Constitution is silent as to what is just, and the Supreme Court's interpretation of just compensation does not require it be market value, nor does it take into account the future value any owner loses when the government takes their land. Further, just compensation is only available to the property owner, thus does nothing for families living in rental properties that are condemned and destroyed. In the 1950s, federal urban renewal programs were used to execute takings of private property for public use, the constitutionality of which was challenged in the courts when Congress passed the District of Columbia Redevelopment Act. The law created the District of Columbia Redevelopment Land Agency and allowed this agency to exercise eminent domain to eliminate areas of blight and transfer the taken land to a private company for development. A store owner in an area marked for destruction and redevelopment fought the decision to destroy his store, which was not blighted. The case was Berman v. Parker, which made its way to the Supreme Court in 1954. All 9 justices agreed the taking was constitutional and noted nothing in the Fifth Amendment limits Congress's power to evaluate the value of what property will be taken and weigh it against what is best for public welfare. The court also determined Congress may take property not considered blighted if it is located in an area ripe for redevelopment due to its placement near a blighted neighborhood, reasoning such a right would be necessary for Congress to execute integrated redevelopment plans. The court stated, if those who govern the District of Columbia decide that the nation's capital should be beautiful as well as sanitary, there is nothing in the Fifth Amendment that stands in the way. After this decision, little did stand in the government's way. From 1950 to 1960, under federal urban renewal programs, the government destroyed the homes of around 126,000 families, and only about 26,000 of those homes were replaced. Most of the homes destroyed housed low-income families, and the housing units built in their place were typically for higher-income families. Of the 126,000 homes taken and destroyed, some were labeled blighted, but about 28,000 of those homes were in perfectly acceptable condition. By March 1963, over 600,000 people were evicted as a result of urban renewal projects, most of whom were Black or Puerto Rican. So let's take a look at a few examples of urban renewal projects and government takings. Alec, tell us about Bruce's Beach in California.
Government takings occurred all over the country, but we'll start by looking at Los Angeles, California. In 1912, Willa and Charles Bruce moved to the area because they wanted a change of pace from living in New Mexico, where Charles worked as a chef for a train line. The couple tried to purchase land several times, but were denied repeatedly due to their race. Eventually, they were able to purchase a piece of land on the water near what is now known as Manhattan Beach, just south of Los Angeles, California. There, they built and ran a blossoming beach resort named Bruce's Beachfront, but to its patrons, it was simply known as Bruce's Beach. Most beaches at the time were segregated, and in the era of the Jim Crow South and racial violence spiking across the country, Bruce's Beach was an escape where Black Americans could relax, swim, dance, and eat. The resort was a huge success, and in 1920, Willa and Charles were able to purchase the adjoining lot and expand their resort. The area soon became a welcoming neighborhood for Black families. While Bruce's Beach was a paradise for Black Americans, to the nearby white residents, it was anything but. They met their new neighbors and resort patrons with racism and hostility. In 1924, the resort's white neighbors, including many real estate agents, decided enough was enough. They started a petition to get the city of Manhattan Beach to shut down the Bruce's Resort. The petition was successful, and Manhattan Beach condemned 30 lots of land, including Bruce's Beach and 4 other lots owned by Black families. Manhattan Beach officials then took the land through the guise of eminent domain, claiming they would use the land to build a public park. The Bruces were paid $14,500. The buildings on the land were demolished, but a park wasn't actually built until 1956, almost 30 years later. The Bruces sought some form of legal remedy, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. To make sure the Bruces would not move their business to a new area, Manhattan Beach passed an ordinance that forbade the opening of any more beach resorts. For almost 100 years, the property was controlled by the government, and eventually ownership was transferred to Los Angeles County in 1995. California state law required the land only be used for public recreation, so the county built their lifeguard administration building on it. In 2021, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed a law that removed the requirement the property be used for the public, which allowed the county to return the land to the descendants of Willa and Charles Bruce. In turn, the descendants rented the land to the county for continued use as a lifeguard administration building. Then, in 2023, the descendants sold the property back to the county for $20 million, significantly more than the approximately $260,000 adjusted for inflation given to Willa and Charles Bruce when the land was taken. Finally, the Bruce family received just compensation for the lost wealth caused by the taking of Bruce's Beach. We'd love to leave you on a high note, but unfortunately, there's more to learn about local governments using federal dollars to bulldoze black neighborhoods through government takings. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, Chris will tell us more about how highways were used as a tool to clear the slums.
Hey folks, Morgan here again. We hope you're enjoying the Unfair Housing Podcast so far. Thank you for joining us, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you would like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. That's 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact CLS Helpline at 800-405-1417. That's 800-405-1417. Don't forget, give us a like and a follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X.
Welcome back. Prior to the time when urban renewal projects were commonly discussed by the federal governments and local governments across the country, New York City officials raised a black neighborhood for public welfare. It might surprise you to hear Central Park is the product of a government taking. Before Central Park was Central Park, a portion of it was a growing community of middle-class black Americans called Seneca Village. Seneca Village was originally owned by John and Elizabeth Whitehead. In 1825, the couple decided to divide and sell 200 parcels of their farmland. Unlike others at the time who would only sell to white families, the Whiteheads did not care who they sold to, so most of their buyers were considered the undesirables, including Irish immigrants and black Americans. The first person to buy land from the Whiteheads was Andrew Williams, a black shoeshine, who purchased 3 lots. Williams was involved in the New York African Society for Mutual Relief, a group that helped black Americans purchase land. He was instrumental in helping to grow the black middle class in the area. Soon after Williams purchased land from the Whiteheads, more black Americans purchased from them as well. Between 1825 and 1832, John and Elizabeth Whitehead continued dividing up their land into lots for sale, selling half of their land mostly to buyers from the black community. By 1855, Seneca Village covered 40 acres and was home to 2 schools, 3 churches, 3 cemeteries, and 264 residents, 2/3 of whom were black. Despite Seneca Village's growth and success, the neighborhood became an area of interest for New York City officials looking for land to create a recreational space to counter the crowded, cramped, and busy conditions the big city life offered in Manhattan. City officials wanted to mirror parks in Europe like Hyde Park, a 350-acre green space in London. Seneca Village was not the first area slated for the new park, however. The original plan was to build the park along the East River. To get the 150 acres the city wanted for the project, it needed to take the land from 2 wealthy white families by using its eminent domain powers. In 1851, a resolution was passed by New York state officials to take the property. Though the land was largely undeveloped, the 2 families did not want to give it up, so they sued, and eventually the city abandoned its plan. The next plan resulted in the Central Park we know today, and unfortunately, the location chosen included Seneca Village, though arguably the park could have been built without destroying the neighborhood, which sat at the west edge near 7th Avenue. In 1853, the city passed a law that paved the way for the development of Central Park, which allowed for the use of 775 acres of land in Manhattan. Local papers labeled the neighborhood a blighted area, and used racist language to describe the neighborhood to gain support from the public for the taking and development of the park. By the time construction on Central Park began, the entire area was home to 1,600 residents, over 15% of whom lived in Seneca Village. The residents of Seneca Village sued to stop the taking of their lands by the city, but unlike the two white men, they were unsuccessful. So in 1857, after 32 years, they were all removed and each of the landowners were paid about $700 per lot of land, which is about $25,000 today, far cheaper than what any land or housing is worth in New York City. While research is still ongoing to determine where residents of Seneca Village went after 1857, what seems to be clear is that they left for other black neighborhoods in the region, including areas in Staten Island. Seneca Village was largely forgotten until the 1990s, when extensive excavations and archaeological digs began in the area formerly home to the village. While there are no photographs of the neighborhood, the findings from the digs provided valuable insight into the daily life at Seneca Village. The area that was once a thriving and bustling enclave for Black Americans is now home to a Central Park playground. In 2001, the city put up an exhibit in the park so visitors can explore the history of Seneca Village. Sadly, Central Park was not the only project that demolished a black neighborhood for public use in New York City. The property where Lincoln Center sits, for instance, used to be the San Juan Hill neighborhood, which was destroyed by plans implemented by Robert Moses. We'll talk about Robert Moses more as we get into highway development, but know he was instrumental in numerous urban renewal and highway construction projects, not just in New York City, but across the country. Alicia, can you tell us about how the government used eminent domain to take property for alleged educational purposes?
Destroying black neighborhoods through government takings to expand colleges and universities was also common practice through the urban redevelopment plans. Because expansion of colleges and universities gave an economic boost to areas impacted by white flight, the National Housing Act was expanded in 1959 to provide these institutions with subsidies and support to expand into blighted neighborhoods, destroying black communities as a consequence. Local colleges in Norfolk, Charlottesville, and Newport News, Virginia expanded their campuses, destroying black neighborhoods in the process. The expansion of the University of Georgia displaced 50 black families to make way for dorms and a parking lot. The University of Oklahoma displaced over 650 black families to build a medical center in Oklahoma City. An expansion of the University of Pennsylvania to build a science center displaced nearly 600 families from a predominantly black neighborhood. As you can see from these stories, urban renewal was a term used to incentivize revitalization of declining cities. However, not all properties taken by the government for revitalization were declining, but they did have one thing in common. They were largely black communities. At this point, things like race-based zoning laws and restrictive covenants were starting to be outlawed by the courts. But the idea of integration was not truly accepted by most white communities. So the government and private citizens needed a way to continue segregation under the guise of rehabilitation. Next week, we'll continue this conversation by looking at how the construction of highways across the country were used to eliminate blight, as the government described it, and talk about the destruction this left behind. Thanks for joining us this week. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, give us a like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Remember to subscribe to the podcast so you'll be notified of all future episodes. Please leave us a comment and share our information with your friends and family. We look forward to having you join us next week. We'll see you then.